What's up, everyone? Andrew from Nine Leaders, and today I have got an incredibly interesting conversation with Colin J. Browne, who is an author, keynote speaker, and is known as the culture guy. Although he'll tell you in the interview he's not all that keen on that moniker. But Colin is a phenomenal change manager with regards to culture in business, how that integrates into people, into results, profit, and specifically around the importance of leadership. So I'm exceptionally excited to have him on the podcast today. If this is the first time to the channel, welcome. It's great to have you. Don't forget to hit the like button down below and smash the subscribe button. This is Colin J. Browne. Colin Browne, welcome to Nine Leaders. It's great to have you. Are you keeping well?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you, Andrew. How are you?
Yeah, very, very well. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. I came to know you first, know of you first when you did work with Flights in a Travel Group in Happy Sandpit. You took them around. Fantastic experience by all accounts. The response and the feedback that we got as a business was really great. So it's really great to have you. You're obviously known as the culture guy. And obviously in these times that we find ourselves in, culture plays a massive, massive role within business. So I wanted to get your opinion on things, ask you a couple of questions, what's happening in your world, where you see the world of work at the moment, what the future looks like, and really just to get an understanding of what this thing we call culture, company culture, really is all about. So before we jump into all of that, your background. We've had a couple of conversations prior to this, but tell us a little bit about you. How did you get into being known as the culture guy? And just fill us in a little bit.
Well, the culture guy name actually is a bit of a it's a bit of a funny story. I mean, I don't like that kind of thing. Okay, I'm not into sort of monikers and that kind of silliness. To me, it's all just a bit contrived.
Yeah.
And so I was resistant to it all along. But you know, the good things guy, Brett Lindecker, right, is a good things guy. And it was really interesting. So I was talking to a guy called Don Packard, a friend of mine who used to be at Missing Link. And he was saying, but you know who the good things guy is? And at the time, I didn't know his name. He said, but you know him as the good things guy. And I said, sure. So we know who this guy is. He said, so do me a favor, call yourself the culture guy. People don't need to know who you are or remember your name. Call yourself the culture guy. And I said, Don, I don't dig that kind of thing. I'm really not into that. He says, no, okay, do this for me. Just change your LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
Just put up there, Colin Browne, the culture guy, and see what happens. So I did, really, to appease him. I swear it was 3 days later, I'm walking out of my daughter's nursery school and somebody goes, hey, the culture guy. So I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I don't know if Don paid them to do that or what, but anyway, so that's where the culture guy came to be. And actually, it's turned out to be quite a good thing because it is quite easy to remember.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, there's a culture guy in the UK, a guy called Ben Drury, who I found on LinkedIn as well. And I connected with him just recently. Great guy, wonderful guy. We've agreed that it doesn't matter who came first. There's plenty of room on the planet for two culture guys. So, but like, I mean, as far as what it is, I mean, the reason that I dare to call myself something like that, very simply, is because I run an organization called Happy Sandpit. The work that we do is all around organizational culture, employee engagement, leadership, and the intersection of those things. And so that means helping companies just come to terms with who they are and how it is that they can be happier places to work. So that's kind of what I do day by day. Deep background was journalism. I got to Happy Sandpit through a previous organization that I'd started, and actually it was the business of building the team up there and adding people that became much more interesting to me than what it was that the business actually did, which is why I ended up down this journey. So that's kind of where we've got to now.
Fantastic. And you've been overseas for quite a while as well. I'm correct in saying that, yeah?
Yeah, off and on. So I mean, I've been back and forth. Look, Andrew, I've moved to South Africa 3 times in my life. I figure if you do that 3 times, if you go to a place 3 times, you probably ought to stay, right?
You should be staying,
maybe it's definitely home. Yeah, I was in Dubai for a while. I was in London a couple of times for a few years at a time. And so, yeah, it's kind of, but I mean, you know, the one thing you learn, and this is very much a sort of a broader set of cultural mores, I think like a South African. I problem solve like a South African. I appreciate things the way South Africans do them. I'm much more entrepreneurial than perhaps many of my counterparts in other countries might be. So this is kind of where I belong, and this is where I've chosen to sort of ply my trade, so to speak.
Absolutely fantastic. And there's so many stories of people coming back to South Africa. Just in the last little while, I've heard. I mean, in the news and the media at the moment, there's all the story about Rob Hersov, obviously the successful billionaire who was overseas for years, and he's come back to South Africa because there's opportunity. So it's great to have you. We're definitely blessed to have you in the country and doing the good work that you're doing. When we talk about culture, and obviously we're in the context of COVID at the moment, things have changed drastically over the last 18 months. Let's start with the baseline. What is culture? When you say culture to a business or to individuals, what do you specifically mean by that, by the term culture?
So Andrew, it's about the way people behave, right? And it's the go-to positions. It's the kind of the natural responses people have to things. So it's quite separate from. I mean, the normal sort of definition of culture, or very often the misconception, is that it's it's something you can influence through committee or something like that. The reality is, I mean, I think what we've seen in the you mentioned COVID. In the case of people being suddenly thrust away from the office unexpectedly, I think what we've seen over the course of the last year, is a year and a half even, is that culture itself has held up rather well. Because in the absence of community and collaboration and all of that kind of stuff, people have simply gone to the go-to positions. The go-to positions in terms of how we elevate things, or how we escalate problems, how we can communicate, all of those sorts of things. I think by and large, culture has held up rather well. But that's people operating with each other and people interacting with the business in the way they know best. The challenge hasn't actually been at the cultural level. The challenge has been at the leadership level, which hasn't so much influenced culture per se. It's maybe forced people to dig more deeply into what they're comfortable with. But it's certainly had a major impact on engagement, which I think is unsurprisingly ridiculous low. And I think what's actually happened is that what we've discovered a couple of things. Okay, I mean, the first one is that most jobs really aren't that good. They never really have been, but it hasn't been obvious to us. When you grew up as a kid, you never dreamed of manning a spreadsheet all day long. It turns out that's actually what you do, but you didn't realize it really before, because it was an office with distractions and people and other things going on, and that community of the office was part of the hubbub of all of that, was part of what actually went on. Whereas working from home, working remotely, working on your own, what I think a lot of people have discovered is that the job's been stripped down to its basic parts, and it's really not that good. And organizations leaders haven't done a nearly good enough job of taking people's eyes off that, like they used to. It used to be that wasn't really the focal point for people who were relatively happy. It was maybe that was one of the boring things that they had to do. Now it's all they do. And not only all they do, they've been doing it for 17 hours a day, and they've been doing it for 6 days a week, and because a whole range of things, which brings us to the second point. The big challenge over the course of the last 18 months isn't so much what's happened and what's been said. It's precisely what hasn't happened and what hasn't been said that is the problem. It's required a CEO to stand up and say, okay, team, listen to me and listen carefully. The email server is going to be switched off at 6 p.m. on a Friday, and it will not be switched on again until 6 p.m. on a Monday, 5 p.m. on a Monday, whatever it might be. So any emails you send in between now and then will not be sent. They will not be received. Okay, all good? Fine. I want you to go home, have a weekend. But that never got done. That never got said. That it was it's almost like, I think maybe leaders weren't really aware of the fact that people were putting in all of these long hours, long days, et cetera, et cetera. And so we kind of perpetuated this situation where people are tired, people are worn out, people have fallen out of love with the job. That's kind of been the story of the COVID era, I think. And there's some rebuilding to do.
Absolutely. You mentioned that the importance of leadership with regards to not in these last 18 months, but culture in general. In your experience, is culture driven top down or bottom up? Is it a case of natural progression as people come together, as companies grow in size, they develop over time? And how much of a role does leadership have to play in that? Is it something that culture can be forced?
No, it can be influenced. Can it be forced? I'm not sure. I tell you what, though. So we used to do these things prior to the pandemic called the 3-day field trips, which were these quite popular things we did. They were quite cool. We'd get executives together, and over 3 days, we'd literally get on a bus and go into a field trip to 7 different businesses over 3 days. And we'd visit the likes of Comair and King Price Insurance, Flight Centre Travel Group. We visited a range of different businesses. And the one thing that was always clear, and it was kind of like one of those jaw-dropping moments for people who are on the trip quite regularly, when they're sitting for the 3rd visit, the 3rd company we've seen on this trip so far, and they're once again in front of the CEO of that business. And this could be Eric Venture at the time, who was the CEO of a publicly traded business, or it could be anybody. But it was the CEO of the business standing in front of us. I'll tell you a story. We went to McDonald's one morning, and we were supposed to be there at 8 a.m. and we're getting across Santon traffic. We're a bit late. We finally get there at 8:15, and they're phoning me, and I'm like, geez, these guys are eager, right? Like we're going to be with them until 1. So like 15 minutes doesn't seem to be that big a deal. There's not much I can do about it. Shall we all relax? Until I realized when we get to the office that Greg Solomon, the South African CEO, is in the office. Now that's quite a cool thing. He's come to see us. He's come to talk to us, except that what the story actually was, he was at a getaway in Durban with his exco. He'd got on a plane early that morning, flown up to Johannesburg, got on the Gautrain to Sandton, come into the office for half an hour to talk to us, and then he got back on the Gautrain and back on a plane down to Durban to rejoin his exco. Because that's how important culture is to the guy. That's how he recognizes the critical importance of it. And I remember sitting at Comair the one time, and the head of HR at the Johannesburg Stock Exchange was with us at that point. He was one of the participants. And he turned to me and he said, I've suddenly realized what's going on here. That's the CEO of a publicly listed business. And he's just talking to a room of 13 people who've turned up to, and by the way, spent 3-4 hours with us that day.
Really?
And to me, that was, I said to him, that's the point here. He's not here because we're here. We're here because he's the guy leading culture. And that's why they're worth coming to see. So there's no doubt whatsoever that this stuff is entirely owned and led from the top. If it is not, then it doesn't really happen. It's as simple as that. Now, I remember, I tell you another story. I remember many, many years ago, the CEO of Hewlett-Packard globally was called Carly Fiorina. And Carly Fiorina was kind of one of these celebrity CEOs. She spent a lot of time at Davos. Eventually, she was just fired by the board one weekend. The reasoning being that she'd seemed to have lost touch with her strategic ideas, because I think she just kind of got washed up with a celebrity. It was dinner with the Clintons and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And she was replaced with a guy called Mark Hurd, who was kind of an administrator. He was just a guy who got stuff done. He wasn't charismatic or particularly interesting, but like really capable. But you could sense a sea change in Hewlett-Packard in Rivonia 3 weeks later.
Really?
I mean, they'd been really difficult to deal with 3 weeks before. Within 3 weeks of Carly Fiorina out, Mark Hurd in, suddenly there's more action, more activity, more decision-making going on. It cascades and it literally is a reflection of the leader putting pressure on their top 3 or 4 people, who then put pressure on theirs. And that's how cascading works, right?
Yeah.
To the point that halfway around the world, the country manager in South Africa is feeling it within a couple of weeks. And cascading it down again.
Wow.
So this stuff can't flow upwards. At the end of the day, and I've often argued the fact that all these organizations that go in for behavior change programs and putting all their people through behavior change, listen, that should only take place with the top 7 people in the organization. Because if they change, it changes. If they don't, it doesn't. And it's really as simple as that. Yeah. I don't know why we make this stuff complicated.
It's so insightful. And it's such an eye-opener in terms of that. It's going the responsibility and the accountability on leadership. One of my old MDs always used to say that the fish rots from the head down. And again, whatever that behavior from a senior leadership aspect, those behaviors just sort of get mirrored within the rest of the staff. From a success side of things, and again, maybe you've named a couple companies already, Comair, McDonald's, but where have you seen real change and companies like that have looked at their culture and gone, right, these things aren't potentially working for us, but these elements are. How do we maximize on the strengths and the positive elements of our culture? Do you have any examples of companies like that?
Yeah, I mean, and there are a few like that, Andrew, and I'll answer that question in a second. But the one thing I would say there is that I think I think one thing that we've learned in working with businesses across the board, the fundamental challenge is it's not just one of philosophy. It ultimately becomes one of strategic focus, right? Business. So here's kind of the sort of the arc. A business is founded by an entrepreneur who probably left employment and left because they got sick and tired of the corporate bureaucracy and 6 signatures for a pencil, that kind of thing. So they went off and they started a business, and they were very idealistic. They had a great plan for how their business would look, and it wouldn't look like that one. And most entrepreneurs who start businesses have got sort of a sense about how to actually generate income, create products, or whatever it might be. They might have marketing experience, sales experience, product development experience, or something like that. And so they go off and they do that. But what they often lack is experience in adding people, building teams, right? Creating that whole human dynamic on which the entire business runs. That stuff's not taught to us, and that stuff is immensely hard because people don't operate quite like policies and processes and products. And you can pretty much write something to get exactly the same result for anything except people. Which is why we like designing robots, right? Because people are really, really hard. So what happens is you start adding people, and suddenly there's a complexity to the business. And as the business grows and grows, you finally get tired of the complexity. You start putting people in place to manage the complexity. And some of those will be managers, and you'll have brought those in from somewhere who will have learned to manage somewhere. And so the cycle starts to repeat. And this is the normal arc. It's not always the case, of course. And then, when you get to a certain size, you start realizing you need more rules, more processes, and so on. So you put some rule putter inners in place, i.e. you establish an HR department who's also probably come from somewhere. And if you started an insurance business, you're probably looking for somebody with insurance HR experience. So therefore, you're starting to rebuild the business that you just used to work for in different format. It doesn't take long before, if you're a successful business, your business starts to feel to the people who work there exactly like the one felt to you that you left. And that's just kind of how it is. Then we get to another challenge, which is we list. We decide to sort of put this thing, sell it to the public, and suddenly what we find is that our owners are no longer, our shareholders are no longer the people in the room. They're no longer the people who own the business. They're no longer the people who can treat it with a little bit of joy, a little bit of love, a little bit of levity. What they are is institutional investors, right? They're pension funds whose only mandate, they can only invest in businesses that have, quarterly growth, that produce dividends. That they have to do that. Those are the rules put out by their whatever they are, stakeholders, whatever the holders of a pension fund are.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, they're focused on this strategic quarterly cycle all the time. And when you start talking about culture, you're talking about something that is open-ended, never-ending, doesn't really have any particular flow to it, et cetera, et cetera. It's not something you can control, put on a spreadsheet, and decide it's going to happen this quarter, which goes a little bit to your previous question. And so what happens, I think, is that over time, a lot of businesses simply lose their ability to influence people in any way, shape, or form. They simply create processes and policies which are followed, and they remunerate people well enough to make them fundamentally follow those processes until things eventually break. And that's pretty much how it goes. And so, you've got large corporates are full of incredibly smart, talented, experienced, educated people. But they say a bad system will destroy a good process, or a bad process will destroy a good person every single time, defeat a good person every time. And that pretty much describes how businesses are. So by and large, when you want to talk about a company sort of revisiting its culture and kind of doing something new with it, it's almost impossible to do, I think. I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do. That said, there are businesses that have done quite a good job of turning some things around. And one example always stands out, which is Nedbank. And I don't know if you know the Tom Borden story. Back in 2004, I think it was, that Tom Boardman became the CEO of Nedbank. Legendary turnaround. Nedbank was the only bank the year before that didn't post a profit. And in fact, if I remember, it shrank by like 90% or something. It was absurd. Its profit shrank, at least. It was in absurdly bad condition. They got themselves distracted with all sorts of things. And while the other businesses were growing, the other banks were growing, they weren't. Tom Boardman came in, and his focus was fix the leadership, fix the culture of the leadership, fix all of that, cascade it down. And I think when he exited sort of 3 or 4 years later, Nedbank was a complete and utter different place, entirely different business. And so that just, but it takes the courage of the leader to be able to do that. It takes the courage of the leader to be able to say, we've got people in place here who have been here for years and who are operationally brilliant, but they're just bad for us. They're just not our fit. They're not going to change. They're not going to listen. They're not going to learn. They're not going to share. We can't do any of that anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's hard though, Andrew. I mean, I think it's really, really hard for businesses to do that.
Is it from a scalability side of things? Do you feel that it's harder for larger organization, just because there's, coming back to your point earlier, where it's literally the realm of the leaders? So if you can change the culture of the top 7 leaders in the business, it'll cascade down. It might take a little bit longer compared to a smaller startup of 30, 40 people. But is that, do you find it more difficult that larger organizations struggle with this?
Yeah, I mean, of course it is more difficult because they're more complex, but I don't think scale is an inhibitor. I mean, not at all. I mean, there are giant global businesses that are, I mean, Microsoft is another classic case of a business that went globally from, being run by Bill Gates, who was an effective CEO, but perhaps not the nicest guy in the world. He was a techie, he was a nerd. Yeah. He took over from him was Steve Ballmer. And listen, I've met Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer is terrifying. I mean, he's 6 foot,
huge guy.
He's loud, he's booming. Yeah. No, he's intimidating. He's not a friendly guy, and he never cared about people. He wasn't remotely interested, nor was he really interested in changing. I mean, Microsoft missed cell phones, they missed tablets, they missed operating systems for all of these things. They didn't even see them coming. And this was just bad vision on behalf of the CEO. And you see Microsoft go from being a kind of a juggernaut that couldn't stop to one that just seemed to be faltering. Enter Satya Nadella. And Satya Nadella has been very clear that the C in CEO stands for culture. And actually, you talk to people at Microsoft today, it's part of the reason we go and see them on the field trip, because they are a wonderfully different business. They are much more people focused, much more, and they're producing world-class stuff again, absolutely world-class. So it's not about scale. Scale is not an inhibitor. It is about the people. It's about the people at the top. Like the CEO's got to sort their team out. Their team's got to sort their teams out. You've got to be ruthless about finding people who just aren't going to make the journey. Yeah. I mean, I say ruthless. One doesn't want to go around with a big axe. One's hoping to move people and help them move with you. But if they won't, they won't. And one of the biggest challenges always is trying to identify those leaders who will be inhibitors. Because you're busy talking about people who may have been around for a while and may have produced good work. Steve Ballmer was an outstanding sort of revenue generator for Microsoft. The reason it rose to the size it was because he was ruthless in that commercial role. It's exactly what they needed. But as a CEO, he was the wrong guy. Yeah. And that kind of happens all through the organization, where you start having people who just frankly need to go or need to move aside or something like that. That's where the challenge is. And in big organizations, there's more of those sorts of people. But it's not in and of itself a matter of scale. I mean, I've had conversations with much smaller businesses where I've been kicked out the door simply because I said to the CEO, who was the founder, the owner of the business, I said, but you can't be involved in this, because the only reason you're in the state you're in is because of you. And I was told that I had no tact and asked to leave. But unfortunately, it's true. That was a small business, and that's a classic case of the wrong leader. Like I'm not telling the guy he can't run his own business, right? I'm not telling him he can't do that. I'm just telling him the state they're in, he's not going to be the guy to fix it, right? So anyway.
Making waves wherever you go.
You don't hire me not to tell the truth, Ed.
Absolutely. If in that regard, if you speaking to, and one of our vision for 9 leaders is really equipping new and experienced leaders with the skills required to take on 2021 and beyond. If you were sitting in front of a group of new leaders that were potentially going through a bit of cultural shift, what would be your biggest advice to those individuals? You mentioned around having the right people, obviously, but what would you give to advice to new leaders if you're sitting in front of a group of 10 or 20 new leaders?
I would tell them very simply this. Their role, no matter which way they look at it, no matter what operational responsibilities they've got, their role is to nurture and grow their people. If they do that, and they will create an effective team, by and large, and again, there's some nuances, but by and large, that's what will happen. If they don't do that, they will spend their lives managing people. And that's the last thing anybody wants to do. It will prevent them from becoming better leaders. It'll prevent them from growing in the organization. It'll prevent everybody under them from growing, and it breeds resentment. And so the simple sort of underlying phrase for Happy Sandpit used to be on the back of my business cards in the day when I had them, is that your role as a leader is not to create or not to make people happy, but to create environments in which happiness is possible in the first place. And so this isn't about trying to win popularity contests or trying to put smiles on people's faces. It's about trying to make sure, or doing their damnedest to make sure, that the people under your command grow, that they have opportunities, and those opportunities aren't necessarily promotion opportunities, but they've got what they need to be able to go out and do their jobs and stretch a little bit, and to have a little courage to do all of that. Because here's the one there's a couple of underlying rules here, okay? The first one is this, that everybody who works for you is contractually obligated to come to work every day. And they're contractually obligated to do their jobs. But not one of them is contractually obligated to give a damn, or to care at all, or to put in a great attitude, or to go the extra mile. Not in the least. It doesn't say that in the contract, and you couldn't make them do it anyway.
Yeah.
They get to pick those things. And so your role as a leader is to make them pick them. That we want them to get out of bed in the morning and go, cool, I get to go do that cool thing today with those cool people. That's what you're trying to create, okay? And so make that your guidance star. What do you do there? How do you create that? What do you do? If you see it as your role to make sure people are at their desks and working, you're not going anywhere. Yeah. It's as simple as that. It was old school. It was never particularly good to begin with. But I think people might have always objected to that style of management. But nowadays we've got language for it. We can frame it differently. And companies are moving away from that. And you're going to get yourself stuck. The other underlying rule is this. On balance and over time, you deserve the people you have. Right? If your people,
that's a scary statement.
Well, so I say on balance and over time, because if you've inherited a team, then maybe you get a little bit of leeway for a while, okay? But the simple fact of the matter is, if your people turn up every day and they get on it and they're working together and the team is good and the results are good, take a bow, because that's not happened without great and inspiring leadership, right? They're rising to something. They're rising to the opportunities that are being created, et cetera, et cetera. So take a bow. If, on the other hand, your people are lazy and they don't do good work and you're constantly having to manage them, I'm afraid that's on you. That's your fault. And that's there's no real way of getting around that. And it's important to say these things, not for the point of view of self-flagellation, but if you can't learn that, you can't fix it. And if you can't fix it, then you will literally buy your way into a never-ending cycle of man-managing, micromanaging. I mean, it's just exhausting. Why do that to yourself?
Yeah. Absolutely. So from that perspective, and I want to bring in another element here. You spoke about obviously the effects of COVID and obviously the remote work, the effect that it has on individuals and team dynamics. What you're saying now, how does that impact, or how does that infer into the return to work? We've seen articles all over LinkedIn the last 3 months around 2022 being the great resignation. This new catchphrase that's out in the market. How do you feel that speaks into enforcing people to, get back to the office? You need to be here in a community. We work in an environment that is conducive, et cetera, et cetera. How do you see that playing out?
So there's a couple of things here as well, Andrea. I mean, so to bear in mind, we're already talking about office workers, right? I mean, people who worked on the roads, people who flew airplanes, people who worked in hospitals, people who worked on farms, they never stopped working the way they'd always worked anyway. Yeah. It applies to a fairly narrow group of people, actually. That said, I think the problem is we are trying to find answers when we haven't got the questions. And so a classic case of a question that needs to be answered to me is this. We need to ask ourselves what we need an office for. Now, I'm not taking a point of view that we need one or don't need one. I'm happy either way. I don't care what you pick as long as it's right.
Yeah.
Okay, but what do we need it for? So if we think about why we had offices in the first place, we had offices because they formed because they were the places that they sat on top of factories. The stuff was being manufactured downstairs. Upstairs, we had people shuffling paper, orders, invoices, that kind of thing. And so they formed an admin function for a factory. Then the factories disappeared. They all went to China. So then we ended up with office parks full of offices shuffling paper on behalf of factories that don't actually exist anymore.
Yeah.
And then along come the pandemic. And well, actually, one step in between, along came cloud computing. This is really the sort of the biggest reason for this question, I think. And it would have happened without the pandemic, but the pandemic exacerbated this.
Yeah.
You wake up in the morning in a house with Wi-Fi. You have a laptop on which most of the work you do is online, right? You might use Google Documents, you certainly use LinkedIn and whatever it is. So a lot of your stuff is happening out in the cloud. Most of my stuff is, which means, but then what you do is you get in a car around 8 o'clock and you drive to an office where you get on the internet, switch on your laptop and re-access all the stuff you could have accessed at home. So you're not at the office because it's a convenience factor. That's not true. It's not convenient. So I can't buy that. I'll accept that maybe it's about collaboration. I'll accept that maybe it's about cooperation. I'll accept those sorts of things. But you'd have to justify to me, if we're going to have that conversation, why it is that every coffee shop in the entire world isn't a better place for us to do work there, or every park for that matter. And then I watched a group of people that are in the company gardens in Cape Town with a whiteboard and sitting around on the lawn having a meeting.
That's awesome.
A while back, while the geese are wandering around in between them and all of this, and you're kind of like, that's how you do a meeting, man. But if you can, I know not everybody can. What I'm saying is that we need better questions. We need to be asking, what is it we need to know here? So one of the questions is, why do we need an office? When we get to an answer to that, we can then decide what to do. But it almost feels like, whether it is a matter of where the companies are very invested in corporate real estate or rental agreements, and they have to try and sweat that somehow, or whether it's just a lack of imagination or managers just haven't really got a handle on all of this, it almost feels like in many instances, we put down a really bad habit around about March 2020, and we're being asked to pick it up again now.
Yeah.
And I'm not an advocate for let's not have an office. I'm not saying that at all. Personally, I've always worked remote, and so this works for me. But I know it doesn't for everybody, and some people miss it. I just think if we're suggesting that going back to an office is going to return us to the way we were, we've missed the point that people have fallen out of love with their jobs, that they're tired, that they've lost some of the respect they had for leaders before simply because of the things that weren't said, as I mentioned before.
Yeah.
It's not quite the same. And so I think it needs a different response. I think companies are putting a stake in the ground. Some of them are saying we're going back to the office, that's it. Some of them are saying we're remote forever, that's it. I think both of them are wrong, and I don't think either of them will stick with that position over the course of the next 3 to 5 years. I think they'll realize that neither of those responses are particularly good. Is hybrid better? Maybe. Is there a third or fourth, fifth option? I don't know. But it's going to be the big question that we need to keep probing over the next few years, because that's the one that's not going away, and that's the one we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah, and again, it's almost the sense of it's either or. Again, to your point is, are we asking the right questions? I love that statement. Looking to the future, well, a little bit back to the past and then into the future. For yourself, you've been very busy over the last 18 months. You have pivoted your business quite successfully. Tell us about the new project that you've got off the ground, and how have you managed to take your business, which is very much, it was very in face-to-face. Like you said, you were taking executives around to different companies. What have you sort of launched in the last while? I know what you've launched, but you tell us.
No, so thank you for that, by the way. So look, so the big thing is we've taken a lot of the workshops that we had and put them online, right? So that's kind of what a lot of people have done. That's fairly normal. But the one thing that's kind of maybe slightly different is we've always been into sort of experiential things. So one example of that is a game which helps with employee engagement through the medium of core values and problem solving, using the metaphor of the Titanic. It's called Iceberg, and that's actually been taken into a fully virtual environment. And it's kind of cool, I have to tell you. It works really well. And there are some other things. We've got a remote working investigative type tool, and the metaphor we've used there is the country of Yemen. We call it, so you opened an office in Yemen, now what? The idea being that, I mean, Yemen is the kind of place that you can pick out on the map, right? And you can.
Well, some of us can pick it out.
Right. Well, you've heard of it anyway, but you've probably never been there.
Yeah.
But you know what? You can imagine if you read the sort of the basic high level literature, it's got bakeries and a bus service and cell phones and apartments. It sounds a bit like Johannesburg, you'd think, except that it's actually very, very different. And if you went there with the Johannesburg playbook, you'd find it incredibly hard. It just wouldn't work. And we think that's kind of an apt metaphor for remote working. The office playbook was no good for this. Anyway, we've been able to kind of take these games, these make-believes, these scenarios, and put them online. And actually what that's done is that's opened up the entire world to us. We're dealing with clients all over the world now, where we really had been almost entirely South African focused before.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, we're starting to be asked once again to come into rooms and sort of play games with people. But what it's meant is, I mean, up until the pandemic, Happy Sandpit was a fairly traditional sort of, perhaps maybe slightly less traditional than many, but experiential learning business. It's pivoted almost entirely to a games development, to sort of learning games business.
Yeah.
And we're having tons of fun just coming up with trying to find the right problem to solve, and then finding out, you know, what's the best way to approach this. So yeah, it's been a bit different for us, and quite cool.
That's fantastic. I mean, I've obviously seen elements of Iceberg as well, and what really impressed me around that was it's even though it's in the online space, you spoke about the return to office and the importance of potentially collaboration, but the games are very experiential around that collaboration element, and you've managed to incorporate that very, very well into the learning outcomes. So yeah, it's from what I've seen.
In a way, Andrew.
Yeah.
In a way, we took. So Iceberg preceded the pandemic. It was a game. So the kind of the development arc for Iceberg was that I had so many conversations with organizations where, see, I believe, and I strongly believe, that the underpinning of culture is going to be some sort of a shared set of rules, right? Some sort of a shared set of, and core values are, call them what you want. They're really, when they're right, and when you've got them, and when you've done the necessary introspection, and when they're real, and when they're not just something that was done in a tick box exercise on a weekend on a Bosparad somewhere or something like that, but you've actually put some effort in, then there's a very different sort of feeling in the business. And Comer referenced them again and again, because under Eric Fenter, they were very much that kind of business where there was an almost complete lack of interpersonal friction between people because they all had a common code. And that's what that does. That's what that does for you. So we do quite a lot of work with core values. We help organizations with that kind of thing in various facets all the time. But you can't always get companies to make the journey with you, right? In a lot of instances, they're just not getting involved in that again, or they don't believe in them or whatever. And it led us to a realization that if you're not obsessed with core values, absolutely obsessed with getting these things right, what tends to happen is that rather than having a set of core values, you end up having a kind of a set of vague preferences. And that's what most businesses have. And they can't align people behind them because they don't really exist, or that nobody really knows what they mean. So we thought what would be quite cool is if we found a way to test those. So very simply, we'll give you an unsolvable problem. We'll give you your set of core values. We put you around the table as a team working together, because one person might be able to find a way out, but you put a team together and you're never going to get it right. And then you've got to come up with something based on the values. And so suddenly they'll come up with a really sort of clever solution to something, which is horrendous because it's lose-lose no matter what, but they can justify it. That to us is what the core values were supposed to be there to do in the first place. So the metaphor was a Titanic, because I'm a giant Titanic nerd. So that was a workshop that I used to run all the time. And then one day I realized that it didn't require me, that actually it was a lot easier than I thought it was. That's just my ego getting in the way. It turns out actually this is quite an easy thing to do. So I thought, well, let's just package it. So we put it into a box with all the cards and the response sheets and pens and all of this kind of stuff. And here's a workshop in a box. And I ended up getting orders from Colombia and Australia and Singapore and the Netherlands and Bulgaria. I mean, this had just never crossed my mind. And I realized that actually there was an appetite for games in the culture space, and just well thought through games that enable people to dig in. So, but I hadn't done anything about going virtual with that. That's really a result of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But so in a way, the pandemic turned out to have some positive outcomes on the business that I hadn't, probably wouldn't have got to without it. So
that's fantastic. That's really, really well done. Further to the future, I believe you've got a book coming out next year. It's your second book, I'm correct in saying.
Yeah, it's been in the writing for a long time.
Yeah.
But this is precisely the Office in Yemen book.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been working on. I've been researching that. So you've opened an office in Yemen. Now what is the title? And it's really about helping companies to come up with the kind of questions that they actually need to be asking. We're actually running workshops around that at the moment. So part of it is it's informal research, because I mustn't just take people's outcomes and sort of publicize those, but it'll certainly help me to understand as well what organizations are doing. Like, I think business books need to be short. I think they need to be punchy. I think they need to be friendly. I think they need to solve a very specific problem and not ramble. But I do think they require research and thought and discipline to make sure that you're not filling people's heads with nonsense. So in the way I do it, at least, it takes a while, to everybody's dismay, including mine.
Well, last question, I think, from us, and I think I pretty much know the answer of what you're going to give, but there's always that expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Right.
Culture versus strategy. Where do you sit on the fence? Do you even sit on the fence?
I don't sit on the fence. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you cannot have one without the other.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the most overused phrases. And I know you use it facetiously here. You're kind of goading me. I think most of the time when it's said, it just, and you can't go to a conference these days without somebody putting up 2 slides and covering culture in that. And one of them is that, right? And it's all about your culture is really important, so get it right. Okay, how? Here's the way I look at it. If you regard, imagine if you and I went on a road trip, right? We went down, so we decided to drive down to, you in Cape Town, right? You're in Joburg.
Johannesburg, yeah. You're
in Johannesburg, because let's suppose you and I get in the car this weekend to go to Cape Town, and we're going to go and watch the Springboks play the All Blacks. So we need a plan, right? I mean, we need to know where they're playing. We need to buy tickets. We need to book a hotel. We need to find out how we're going to get there, etc. So there's some plans, but and all of this forms part of the strategy, right? With a goal at the end, and without that strategy, without a route and a vehicle and a figure out how we're going to cover the petrol and how we're going to share the snacks, without any of that kind of stuff, we may as well just get in the car and drive north, for all that it matters, or not get in the car at all. But we're going to get into the car with a purpose, so we need to know where we're going and all of that. And so strategy is critically important. If we don't have that, we are pointless. We're rudderless. There's really no point in doing anything. And how do we know whether we're doing the right thing? Yeah. But strategy's got a habit of being buffeted by the wind, right? So internal pressures, external pressures. Turns out your turbo blows on your car. Touch wood, hope that doesn't happen. But now we've got to use my car. My car's less good than yours. I got to get it serviced. That kind of thing might happen before a road trip. And then, as we're heading down the highway, there'll be a tanker fire outside Bloemfontein. Suddenly we can't go down the N1 anymore. We're going to get off from back roads all the way down to De Aar and whatever it might be. That happens. External, internal threats. All of that stuff is just the norm. The problem with it is that because we don't focus on culture strongly enough, this is the kind of stuff that drives people batty. You start to wonder who's running this ship anyway. Yeah. Is there any point to this? Oh, we make one decision this week, this decision that week. What a nightmare. And that's a lot of the experience that people have, simply because this culture element isn't figured out. The culture element of all of this is what goes on inside the car, right? You and I set out to make the road trip legendary. So sure, our purpose is to go and watch the Springboks, and the route we're taking is down the N1. But in the car, man, we got cool music, we got cool snacks, we're digging it. It's awesome. That's necessary, because tomorrow we got to drive back. Well, the day after, or a week or whatever, we got to drive back. And ideally, if you're looking at sort of a 2 or 3 or 5 year strategy, every single day is a road trip. You're going to want people to make 1,000 daily road trips, which means what goes on inside that car every single day is what you need to be focusing on in order for the strategy to play out. Because you can get people to drive back and forth to Cape Town in silence in a car, hating each other's guts. You just can't get them to want to do it. You can't get them to want to do it and make it legendary. So they'll just go through the motions, and that's what's going on here. And this is why people are putting on a work hat and turning up instead of getting in the car and going, awesome. And it goes back to that leadership question about what is your role as a leader? It's to create a road trip every single day. Make sure the road trip is legendary. Because if the road trip is legendary every day, 1,000 road trips later, you've reached the strategy, you've reached the goal, and everybody kind of dug it, and it was awesome. In the absence of that, you're just driving down the road.
Yeah.
So culture doesn't eat strategy for breakfast. Culture brings love and life to strategy, without which it would simply be cold and clinical and really hard to get excited about.
What I love about your approach is that when people start talking culture, it's often the soft skills, the squidgy part of business, and you make it really real. There's no bullshit. You say it as it is. This is the importance of it. And like you said, it's the strategy is the rudder, the direction in which you're going, but the culture really is the how you actually showing up, how you turning up, how you engaging. And that's the actual journey from what you've just said now. Colin, if people want to get a hold of you, obviously through your website, we'll put all the links down in the description in the video. It's been absolutely fantastic and incredibly insightful. I can't wait to see the new book in the new year.
Pressure.
Absolutely. Accountability. We got to hold you to it. You said it out. You put it out into the universe now. Now it's done.
All right.
But Colin, like I said, it's been great to catch up with you again. All the best in the coming months and for the new year. And we'll definitely have to have you back again to see how things have progressed in the world of culture and the new world of work, as we call it now.
And thank you very much as well, Andrew. I really enjoyed it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Listen, take care of yourself and we'll chat soon.
Cheers, everybody.
Ciao.